现在将进行问答及专题讨论，有请本环节主持人郝宇凡教授、邵善波先生移步至台上。
Now we will come to the Q&A session and panel discussion. Let's welcome the host, Professor Hao Yufan and Mr. Xu Xinpo, to come to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy here to be part of this discussion. And as this chance come to Macau, well, not actually 3 years. I've been here quarantined for 14 days. And meet a lot of friends. Professor Movimani is a long-time friend. I haven't seen him for several years. And the world certainly has changed hugely. We have a saying that we have seen change not seen in 100 years. But I think it's a lot bigger than that. My version is that we have not seen change since 3,000 years. To be more conservative, I think we are flipping a page since the 16th century when the West is coming to Asia. The West, with their big ships, conquer Americas, Africa, and then start coming to Asia since the 16th century. I think we are on the verge of flipping this page. So at least we are changing in a huge way, and it's not very clear the way forward. It's going to be messy. Kishore is an old friend. He said this topic, which is a huge topic. I always have a problem of using Asia, Europe, or Africa, because it's basically a Mediterranean-centric concept. The concept is based on Mediterranean, and they call north of it Europe, east of it Asia, south of it is Africa. It's not a very well-defined term, but we have to use it because it's so common. The second, Kishore make a very good case about Asian century. I have questions with that. No doubt, the way of the world is shifting towards this part of the world. But what does that mean? Does that mean that the Asian is going to mold the world or help to change the world? Well, that definitely. But in what directions? It's a huge question. And are we ready? Ready for what? Are we ready? Ready for what? Well, this part is the discussion. I hope Professor Kishore can answer some question, and we'll first have Professor Hao to give a response to the speech that the professor just gave.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I would say I have benefited a lot from Professor Mahbubani's talk today. Very insightful, very, I would say, very stimulating. Yeah, I have learned a lot. And I'm sure our students would also benefit a lot. Actually, the Macau University of Science and Technology have established its international relations PhD program 10 years ago. And we have graduated quite a number of students well trained in IR and have worked in various areas contributing to our good understanding and maybe even good actions to our foreign relations. And I have actually I have read your work and I listened to your today's talk. I appreciate that you mentioned 3 resistance in the possible Asian century. One is the so-called geopolitics. I totally agree with you. And we have seen, particularly the last year, that the world has witnessed a turbulent and I would say quite a transformation. Say, Russian-Ukraine conflict and accelerated tension between the United States and China. And we have seen, probably you have heard that the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Qin Gang, has mentioned that the United States seems to made all efforts to contain and suppress China in all respect. And if that will not stop, probably there might be a catastrophic consequences, right? So you mentioned the first resistance is largely coming from the United States. I would like to hear your opinion that whether with that strong geopolitical resistance coming from the United States, are you still optimistic about the possible Asian century? That's number one. And the second, you mentioned that another resistance is coming from the West. The West largely trying to resist non-West Asian to rise, right? And in your book, you mentioned particularly the huge imbalance between the so-called normative and the cultural power in the West and that of the non-West, right? So what should we do to really make sure that Asian century would come, right? And third, I think you mentioned that that is partially true, that the West has taught us the virtue of free trade. And many countries benefited from the free trade, particularly China in the last 2 decades. But now there is an increasing protectionism coming from the West. We know that the globalization, it seems to have halted to a certain extent. And maybe the deglobalization has become a trend. So to what extent that may also be regarded as a resistance to the possible of mutual beneficial and may contribute to the possible Asian century, okay? And I have a question, particularly after listening to your very insightful talk. Talking about the Asian century, then there has to be a united Asia. But do you think that India and China could reach a deep understanding in this and really cooperate hands in hands to make sure that the Asian century would come together to fight against those 3 resistance that you mentioned? That is part of my comment and part of my question.
Right?
Sure. Thank you, Amit. Thank you very much for your very insightful comments, and I do agree with some of them. And the thing about the US-China contest, of course, given the limited time, we didn't have time to go into it. The US-China contest, like as in any crisis, will create dangers, but it'll also create opportunities. So, for example, the United States realizes that it is behind in the economic competition. So the United States has now come up with the idea of Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Now, we're not quite sure what the content will be of IPEF, but United States still remains a formidable economic power. I mean, United States is still the #1 economic power in the world. Let's be very clear about it. And the United States, in my book, Has China Won, I say, it'd be a mistake to underestimate the United States. And, American universities are still remarkably productive, remarkably innovative universities. So if the United States decides to share some of its intellectual productivity, some of its economic productivity with countries in Asia is not a bad thing. And by the way, you mentioned deglobalization. If you can Google, go to something called the Asian Peace Program. This is something that I personally launched. I'm the coordinator of the Asian Peace Program. Every month we come up with an essay. And last month we came out with an essay by a scholar, I think from China, I think now based in the US, where he gives the data that shows that despite the trade war, trade between US and China has grown.
Yeah.
So, and I think also investment is constant. So paradoxically, even on the US-China front, trade and economic relations haven't gone down. So if the United States decides to play a more active role economically in this region, it'll be good for this region and our region will grow. So that in that sense, the contest will not be bad. Now, on the question of India and China, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'll be very frank with you all. I shouldn't say this publicly, but it's a fact. And I believe that if you want to be an analyst, you must speak the truth, even if the truth is uncomfortable. And the uncomfortable truth is that relations between China and India are bad today. I mean, they're not disastrous. But I give you a simple example. The one leader, the two leaders who had spent a lot of time talking to each other were President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. They spent hours and hours in Wuhan, in a town in India. And then, unfortunately, there was an accident at the border. There was a clash between Chinese and Indian soldiers. And in June 2020, unfortunately during COVID time, so you couldn't repair relations. And so since then, there has been no bilateral meetings between President Xi and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, although they did shake hands at the Bali G20 meeting. I'm hopeful that relations between China and India will gradually improve. But even if relations between China and India don't improve, there is still a much larger number of countries in Asia. Asia has got about 50 countries. And so if you look overall, the share, the Asian share of global GDP used to be smaller than that of the United States, used to be smaller than that of the European Union, right? I think within 10 years, Asia's share of global GDP will become larger than EU and United States combined. That's the Asian century. If our GDP becomes larger than US and EU combined, then we are a much bigger economic actor. So even though, and by the way, even though relations between China and India are bad, trade between China and India has gone up. So there's a paradox, And by the way, that is just to give you an example of the complexity. Because of the US-China contest, American firms are insuring themselves from a downturn in US-China relations by creating what they call a China +1 strategy. So American firms are investing in China, but they're also investing in Southeast Asia. They're investing in China and they're investing in India. Well, this creates an interesting issue. The Indians are worried about the trade deficit with China, which is very large. Used to be 70 billion, last year is 100 billion. But why did the trade deficit go up? The trade deficit went up because Apple is now investing in India. Now when Apple invests in India, it needs spare parts. Where do the spare parts come from? From China. So the spare parts go from China to India, the trade deficit goes up. But India's economy benefits. You see, the paradox here. So it's a win-win game, it's not a win-lose game. So even when relations are bad, you can still carry on. And I think India, at the end of the day, also realizes that its destiny is with the rest of Asia. And so it will, I think, make sure that its relations with Asia at large is also equally strong. So I'm how do you say, worried about China-India relations, but still a bit hopeful that things can improve. Cautiously optimistic.
Kishore, when you talk about Asia, you focus on China, India, and ASEAN. But we have a huge part of the Middle East and large part of Russia and the war happening in Ukraine and Russia. That's also Asia too. Can you say something in that area too?
Sure. But it's important to understand that if you include the CIA, you get the bulk of Asia. The total population of Asia, I don't have it exactly, is roughly 4.5 billion out of 8 billion. China, India, ASEAN make up 3.5 billion out of 4.5 billion. So the rest of Asia is only 1 billion. And you're right, it's spread among the Arab countries, among Central Asia, among Japan, South Korea, and all that. But they're all much smaller in terms of population. Now, we certainly have a war in Ukraine that's going on. But you know, one of the great paradoxes of our time, and I'm going to publish an essay on this very soon, pointing out that when the Cold War ended, everyone thought, in fact, I quote an American scholar, Aaron Friedberg, who said that Asia's future will be Europe's past. In the past, all the big wars were in Asia. Now all the big wars will be in, all the big wars were in Europe. Now the big wars will be in Asia. Now the Cold War ended about 30 years ago. In the past 30 years, there have been 0 major interstate wars in Asia. You know how many wars in Europe? The Yugoslav wars, several wars. You had the wars in Georgia. You had, and then of course I'm leaving aside the United States war in Iraq, United States war in Syria, United States war in Libya, and then you have the Ukraine war. So what we in Asia have done in terms of preserving peace in Asia, is, especially East Asia, is a remarkable success story that has gone unnoticed by the world. But I'm going to make a short comment, Shin Po, and you raised a very important point when you said, what does the term Asia mean? Yeah. Is there an Asia? And I'm going to give you a very personal answer just to illustrate that a lot of the traditional connections within Asia were cut by 200 years of colonial rule. And because of that, we forget that we have traditional links in all over Asia. So I'll give you a few simple examples. I'm Indian, and my family were Hindu Indians. And my surname is Mehbubani. But Mehbubani comes from an Arabic Persian word, Mahbub, which means beloved, by the way. So my name, Mehbubani, comes from the Arab and Iranian world, which are Muslim, even though I'm Hindu. Now, of course, as a Hindu, I have a connection with the 1 billion Hindus in India. But when you come to Southeast Asia, out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, 9 of the 10 ASEAN countries have an Indic cultural base. So Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, they perform the Ramayana from the Hindus, right? And then if you go north to China, to Japan, to South Korea, one of the most important strains in China, Japan, Korea is the Buddhist strain. Where does Buddhism come from? Buddhism came from India. And so when I was young, I used to pray in Hindu temples and I used to pray in Buddhist temples. So when I go to Japan or South Korea and I go to a Buddhist temple, it is not foreign to me. So you can see, stretching all the way, I call it from Tehran to Tokyo, there are cultural connections all the way. So there is a kind of cultural synergy within Asia that is not appreciated or understood yet, but it will come back now as Asia returns.
You bring out a very good point. Before the European comes to this part of the world, there was the Silk Road.
Yeah.
Both the land Silk Road and the sea Silk Road. And all these country and people are trading with each other peacefully until the West came with their guns and big boats. Huh? Now China is now doing this Belt and Road, huge program. Actually, it's a revival of what's happening 500 years ago or more. And that certainly is a huge challenge to the West, and that's why they get them very nervous. I think I will entertain a few questions from the audience and the students and other faculties. I'm sure some of them might have a question or two for Professor Kishore.
Thank you, Professor Kishore. Really appreciated your expertise and brilliant ideas. Thank you so much. I'm a PhD student, international relations, majoring in the Institute for Social and Cultural Research. And here's my question. Like 19th century was the European century, like you said, and 20th century was the American century. And both of these two centuries brought new ideas, rules, and values and order to the world. So as you said, the 21st century was projected to be the Asian century. So what kind of political, economic, cultural, or social values, orders, and rules that we, Asia, can contribute to this world? Thank you very much.
Well, that's a very difficult question. But I'm very happy that you can see how brilliant the students are of Macau University and Science and Technology question. They can ask a very round of applause for the brilliant question. I have a long answer for you and a short answer for you. My short answer for you is that it's a work in progress. And I say work in progress because if you look at the history of societies, first you have an economic resurgence. And when you have the economic resurgence, you have the creation of surplus wealth. And with the surplus wealth, this is what happened in Europe. You got the European Renaissance, right? People had money to subsidize artists, painters, thinkers, authors, and so on and so forth. So in Asia, what you have seen so far is the great economic resurgence, but the natural consequence after that will be the great Asian Renaissance, which is why I'm actually looking forward to the next 10 years of my life, assuming I stay 10 years. That the next 10 years of my life are going to be very exciting on at least two counts. One, I will be alive to see the greatest geopolitical contest ever seen in human history within China and the United States, and things will get rough. I'll see that. And on the other hand, within Asia, I predict a major cultural renaissance. Now, in this cultural renaissance, I don't think that the Asians will just go back to their own ideas from the past. In fact, as I argued in an essay that I published with Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard University, you can look for it in the magazine Foreign Affairs. The article is called The Fusion of Civilizations. So we in Asia will copy the best of the West. So for example, we should not give up free market economics. We should not give up Ricardo's theories of law of comparative advantage. We are going to benefit from it. We should embrace. And in fact, even the United Nations And the values of the United Nations were gifted by the West. But they're good for us because they say every country should have equal say. That's good for us. So we Asian countries can have an equal say. But at the same time, there is a kind of emphasis, especially within, I would say, East Asian societies, for harmony rather than friction. Whereas the Western societies believe in contestation, and they believe that contestation is the way to move things forward, whereas we in Asia say, hey, let's preserve harmony. And I can tell you, the reason why ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is the second most successful regional organization in the world, and I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle about it, is because we took two Indonesian concepts of musyawara and mufakat, consultation and consensus. So instead of having contestation, we have consultation and consensus based on two Javanese principles, and that's why ASEAN succeeded. Indeed, if you look at the current issue of the magazine Foreign Affairs, the March-April issue, I argue in that article that what ASEAN has done now provides a model for the rest of the world. So look at that article, it's in the current March-April issue, and that's an example of how an Asian idea can transform the world.
In short, Kishore raised this concept of Asia and Asian century. It's just a start. A lot of things has to be filled in by later generations and years to come. That's why it's a century.
Brilliant young people from the young generation.
It's not just a decade, it's a century. Good.
Really enjoyed your talk as a Singaporean MEST staff. So yeah, actually your opinion is very sharp and direct, saying that China won. Although I not yet downloaded this book, but I still could say I'm your super fan. But if we look for the opinion of what Singapore government doing, so we could see that Singapore government a little careful and try to balance each country. And but sure, your opinion much more direct. So, but what could be the internal strategy for the Singapore government?
Thank you. I'm very glad to get a question from a fellow Singaporean who's asked me a politically difficult question. He's asking me whether I agree with the Singapore government or not. So of course I have to say I agree. No, but more seriously, I want to emphasize that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Singapore government, even though I did work for the Singapore government 33 years as a diplomat. And I think the Singapore government is trying to walk a very fine line. As you know, the Prime Minister of Singapore has been among the bravest prime ministers of any small country, because he's the only one who has spoken openly about the US-China geopolitical contest. And he has said that Singapore wants to be friends with China, and Singapore wants to be friends with the United States, and we don't want to take sides. And that's the view of many, many countries around the world. They don't want to take sides between the United States and China. But of course, Singapore has also gone one step further and said that, told the United States and China, when you carry out this contest, please be careful. Don't damage us. We also will be affected. If you are in a small, just imagine all of you sitting in a small room like this, and then two elephants walk in and start fighting each other. Now, even though they're not going after you, you may be crushed. So that's why Singapore is worried about this geopolitical contest. But it's also true that the Singapore government is very optimistic for the future. And this is one thing that the Singapore government doesn't say, but I say this in my writings, including in my book, The Asian 21st Century, that just as in the 19th century was the European century, And the capital of the European century was London, because London was the center of all activities, commercial, cultural. And the 20th century was the American century, and the capital was New York, commercial, financial, cultural center. The 21st century, the Asian century, the one city that can become the natural capital of the Asian century is Singapore. Because Singapore is the only place where the four major civilizational streams of Asia come together. You know, Chinese civilization is present in Singapore, Indian civilization is present in Singapore, Islamic civilization is present in Singapore, and also Western civilization is present in Singapore. So Singapore actually will turn out to be one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Asian century.
Well, Kishore has to be optimistic about it.
He's promised not to ask a difficult question.
The questions are always difficult.
Afternoon, Professor. I want to ask that as Chinese students in Macau University and technology, science and technology, what should we do to be ready for the Asian century? What should our students do?
Yes.
Thanks.
Well, that's a very, very good question. And I would say that, you know, as you know, China is still the largest country in Asia. And China is still the largest economy in Asia. And China is the most powerful, single most powerful Asian country. But still, China's population of 1.4 billion is still above a quarter of Asia's population. So there's still about 3/4 Asians outside China. It's important for the Chinese people to study the other Asian cultures and get to understand them very well. Get to understand, for example, India very well. Because the Indians, and I'm Indian as you know, look at the world very differently from the way the Chinese look at the world. The Indian mind is very different from the Chinese mind.
The philosophy is different.
Yeah, the Indian mind is an argumentative mind, as the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen said. Okay, so you got to understand that. And similarly, by the way, even your close neighbors, South Korea and Japan, have a very different perspective. And certainly in Southeast Asia is also quite different from China. So it's important for young Chinese to go out and visit other Asian countries and study their history and culture and then develop the networks. Because it is these networks among the young people in Asia, especially led by Chinese students, that will help to build bridges for the Asian century.
Well, this university certainly can play a role in this.
Thanks.
No more questions? Oh, one more. Okay. This is the last one, I guess.
Respect, Professor. I have a question that how can China and Singapore work together in the Asian century? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lee Hsien Loong is coming today.
Well, I think Singapore, as you know, is in a very unique position vis-a-vis China. Now, I serve as ambassador to the UN. The United Nations has got 193 member states. Only 2 states have a majority Chinese population. China, which is 100% Chinese, Singapore, which is 75% Chinese. So China and Singapore are very unique. But at the same time, Singapore is not a Chinese society. Singapore is a multiracial society. And also in terms of its politics, culture, very, very multiracial. So for example, when I was sent as the Singapore ambassador to the UN, people were very surprised. How can someone, I represent a minority within a minority in Singapore, by the way. The Indians are the minority, but most of the Indians are Tamil. I'm Sindhi, so I'm a minority within a minority. But that's Singapore. That's very multiracial Singapore. So Singapore can help to provide a bridge between, let's say, China and Southeast Asia, because what we in Singapore have done very well is to understand our Southeast Asian neighbors very well. And we understand what their sensitivities are, what they're concerned about, what's in their hearts, and we can share that. And so that's a kind of a positive role that China and Singapore can play together. And by the way, I read in the Singapore papers today that the Prime Minister of Singapore is visiting China this week.
No, today.
Today, he's there. So I think the relations within China and Singapore today are very good, but I think they can become even better in the years to come.
Professor, you know what? Well, we have come to the end of this dialogue. I hope that everybody gets something out of this, and this dialogue can be continued in some form in the future. Thank you for coming.
感谢马凯硕教授与邵善波先生、郝宇凡教授的分享，请3位留步，有请公关同学送上鲜花。非常感谢，请3位嘉宾移步至台下就座。
Thank you all for your sharing. Please be seated.
今天的讲座非常精彩，让我们在外交与全球性议题上上了宝贵的一课。
We have learned a lot from this wonderful lecture, especially on diplomat and global issues.
在此，让我们以热烈的掌声再次感谢马凯硕教授的精彩演讲，以及各位尊贵来宾的出席。
Let's give a big applause to Professor Kishore Mahbubnai and all the distinguished guests.
下面我宣布，澳门科技大学外交学术讲座到此圆满结束。
Now it has come to the end of the talk of diplomacy.
再次感谢大家出席今天的讲座，预祝大家度过愉快的一天。再见。
Thank you all for your attendance. I wish you all had a pleasant day. Goodbye.